that God mandated some people to invade and conquer the land, but that none ever did. If the stories of conquest were made up, then it seems to me that the stories of God mandating conquest were made up as well. And if the writers were telling the made-up stories of conquest in the fictive mood, then presumably they were also telling the made-up stories about God's mandating conquest in the fictive mood. Or if they were telling them in the assertoric mood, they would have been lying. And in any case, what sense would it make for the Deuteronomic writers to combine into one narrative stories about the conquest told in the fictive mood with stories about God's mandating the conquest in the assertoric mood, asserting them for true? As for myself, I neither believe that the stories of conquest were made up and told in the fictive mood, nor that the stories about God's mandates were made up and told in the fictive mood. My view is that the book of Joshua was never meant to be read literally. My view is that if we read the book closely, and in conjunction with the book of Judges, we see that it's not a story, be it fictional or non-fictional, about a brutal genocidal conquest of an entire land. And if that's true, then I think we must infer that it's also not a story, be it fictional or non-fictional, about God commanding such conquest, though some people after this morning session challenged me on that point. It's true that over and over in the book of Joshua, we find the line, and they slew all the inhabitants with the edge of the sword. But I repeat a point I made this morning. Suppose you ask some high school basketball player how his team fared in the game they played the night before. And suppose he says, we slaughtered them, wiped them out, just like the coach told us to. What can you conclude from that comment about how his team treated their opponents and how their coach wanted them to treat their opponents? Very little. That their coach fired them up to win the game and that they did. That's pretty much it. I think such language is typical of combat situations, be they games or real combat or whatever. So I trust that the distinctions I've been using between what's made up and what's not made up, second, between what's presented in the fictive mood and what's presented in the assertoric mood, and third, between what's literal and what's not literal, don't give problems. The writers of fiction and nonfiction alike sometimes speak literally and sometimes speak non-literally. So let me use the concept of the world of the work. I hold that the contents of the world of the work of Joshua were not, for the most part, made up by the writers, and that the writers presented that world in the assertoric rather than in the fictive mood. But I also hold that in presenting the world of the work, they were in great measure using language non-literally. And so it proves to be no easy task at all to figure out what is in fact the world of the work that they're presenting to us. What is in fact the world that the writers projected and presented in assertoric, rather mood to their readers. But back to Professor Anderson's paper. On his view, if I understand him, we should take literally what the stories say about God's mandate of conquest. Though he is quite clearly of the view that these stories are presented in the assertoric mood, it's not central to his purposes on this occasion to argue that point, nor is it central to his purposes on this occasion to decide even whether the stories are true. He wants to get at what he calls the simple sense of the texts with respect to what they present God as doing in the story, and they're going to have that sense, whether or not they're presented in the fictive or the assertoric mood, and whether or not they're true. So the first part of Gary's way of dealing with the question of whether what God is presented as doing is just or unjust is to highlight a theme that has sounded over and over in the texts, namely that God promised this land to Abraham and his descendants, it being assumed that the members of Israel were Abraham's descendants. In the normal case, the right of a people to a certain territory is based on natural phenomena of one sort or another, as he observes. But Israel was unique. The land of Canaan belonged to Israel because God had promised it to them. It did not belong to the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and all the rest of them. Had God not promised the land to Israel, those other people would have had a right to it by virtue of the natural phenomena that normally give a people title to a certain piece of land. but God promised it to Israel, and so it belonged to Israel. The idea is that Israel's right trumps their prima facie natural rights to the land. That's the assumption. And Gary follows the Israeli biblical scholar Uriel Simon in calling Israel's right to the land a providential right, in contrast then to natural right. And he mentions some, I think, very interesting and important things that Simon says about providential rights to land in general and about Israel's providential rights in particular. To a degree unique among the nations of the world, in contrast to Hittites. Unique among the nations of the world, Israel's identity has not depended on its occupation of land. Israel is already depicted in the biblical writings as having had a national identity before it entered the Promised Land. And now, over some 3,000 years, more or less, it has maintained its identity in spite of long periods of exile from that land. This is remarkable and unique. Israel's dwelling in the land at any particular time, then, is an act of special providence on God's part. It's not a condition of Israel's existence. And it's open to God to establish as a condition for Israel's abiding in the land that Israel remain faithful to Yahweh. Note that Yahweh's expulsion of Israel from the land, should Israel become faithless, would not be sentencing Israel to extinction, as would be the case for any other people. Professor Anderson rightly emphasizes that from the fact that the land belongs to Israel, it does not follow that Israel has a right to take its land when and as it wishes. Even though the land belongs to, quote, the eternal patrimony of the descendants of Abraham, I'm quoting Gary here, it's not a land that God can simply hand over at will. The rights of the citizens who presently reside upon it must be respected. Professor Anderson postpones for another day the question of what this implies for legitimate and illegitimate ways of taking the land, and concentrate simply on the conditions that must be satisfied for Israel to have the right to take its land in some way or other from the present inhabitants. He interprets the text as saying that if and only if the inhabiting nations deserve the divine punishment for their misdeeds of being conquered, does Israel have a right to take by conquest the land that belongs to it. So let's pull things together. Israel has a right to this land on account of God having promised it to them as Abraham's descendants, and it has the right to take the land now because its present inhabitants deserve being punished by God for their misdeeds by having the land taken from them. So Israel is in the clear. It acts justly in taking the land. And God is also in the clear. God authorized Israel to take its promised land only if its inhabitants at the time were so wicked as to deserve being punished by God for their misdeeds by having their land taken from them. And they are so wicked. Now, before I make a few critical comments about this solution to our problem, let me just observe, I'm not going to develop it though, that this is actually very close to Calvin's way of defending God and justifying Israel, namely it's the wickedness of the inhabitants. So let me pose 3 points on which I'm not entirely satisfied with Gary's solution to the problem. First, though I think the picture that he has drawn is interesting picture is compatible with the simple sense of the texts, I think that on a point central to his argument, it goes beyond what they actually say. Interpretations often go beyond what the text says. Over and over, the texts declare that God attaches to Israel's abiding in the land the condition that it remain faithful to Yahweh. This is, in fact, the central point that the texts home to the reader. But I think we are extrapolating if we say that God likewise attached to Israel's taking of the land the condition that Gary suggests.
We are at about 2 minutes.